So thank you all for welcoming me here. And this being an event on profitability and regeneration, I thought I might kind of, thinking of profitability, money, I think I would like to kind of begin by exploring, and that will be a theme throughout what we are talking about, wealth. Just what is wealth? And how can our understanding what wealth is guide us in our decision making? So a while back, I started thinking about money and wealth in a new way through the inquisitive eyes of a reporter, which I am. I was freelancing at the time with a lot of time on my hands, and I started asking some questions. Interestingly, Tara ended her presentation by talking about what's important is asking the right questions. And I believe that that's important in all different areas, including when you're a reporter. You can only get as true and as whole and complete an article as the quality of your questions allows for. So the kind of questions that I was asking was, why does nature have a value of 0 in our economy? Is the GDP the best measure of prosperity? And does it incentivize the right practices? And how does money flow? And why does it stream out from rural areas and into the money centers? So I live in a rural area, so I was able to see this up close. Journalistically, this was a good run, all these questions. Learning all the way, I wrote a bunch of articles. I even wrote a piece for Time magazine on establishing local currencies. And after more than a year of exploring this topic, I felt I'd arrived at an answer to the very basic question of what is wealth? Or at least a question that works for me. And that is soil. This understanding launched me on the whirlwind of writing 3 books in 8 years. The first one is Cows Save the Planet and Other Improbable Ways of Restoring Soil to Heal the Earth. This is really a kind of soil's eye view of the world, told through narrative. I talk about soil and wealth through stories of farms in North Dakota. Any North Dakotans here? So that is the last chapter of the book. And I remember it's called The Soil Standard. And I remember the whole time I was writing the book, I was thinking about, oh my gosh, I need to really close this book with an in-depth, sharp look at soil and the economy. And I was so nervous about doing that, but I think it worked. According to the readers, it worked. So I looked back on this last chapter the other day and found some gems, some quotes. So this is from Wes Jackson of the Land Institute. The only true economies are nature's ecosystems. Then for another, the visionary soil scientist William Albrecht wrote, all the capital in all the banks cannot substitute for the soil of the land. We know of no bank with all its money that could, by means of that wealth, have a litter of pigs, lay an egg, or give birth to a calf. And this all too timely quote by British physician and organic pioneer G.T. Wrench, the stark fact that appears now and which wrote itself across the Roman Empire is that debt and taxation increase as the soil declines. I'd say nothing we don't intuitively know. I will quickly introduce the other 2 books and then share some stories from my reporting. So, having written a book about soil, it made me crazy that when people talked about water problems like flooding and drought, they talked about it as if it was all about what does or doesn't come down from the sky. Because after kind of thinking about soil all the time, it kind of was clear to me that you can't really talk about water unless you're also talking about land, about the soil. So I wrote this book that explores how water works and how not water as a noun, but water as a verb, and how understanding how water moves across the landscape and through the atmosphere can help us deal with many of our challenges. For instance, I have a story in the book about a couple who had built what they call a rain barn, where they get all of their water from dew, from condensation. Finally, I was seeing lots of examples of ecosystem restoration around the world, but few people knew these stories. I wanted to change that, because how can one imagine the transformation of landscapes without knowing that it happens, without understanding how it was done and how we can work with nature, as I write in the title, to heal the earth. Now let's do a little bit of travel. First, to Zimbabwe in southern Africa. So we have here some of my favorite animals, elephants. And elephants like water. They drink water and they like to bathe, wallow, and play. Yes, play. They're very playful. Here we are at the Dimbengombe Ranch near Victoria Falls. Back in the 1970s and 80s, this area was considered wasteland. It was barren and dry, and when it rained, there would be terrible floods. During the long dry season, the river would stop flowing. As a result, elephants had to travel long distances to get to the one permanent pool. This meant extra effort on the part of the elephants and exposed the entire herd to predators. Enter Alan Savory. Many of you have likely heard of Alan Savory, and some of you might even know him. It's hard to believe that this fellow is now 90 years old, a milestone that he celebrated by traveling to England so that he could fly a Spitfire plane, which he happily did. And having visited him in Florida this June, I can tell you that he still walks around barefoot, something that his wife, Jody Butterfield, had to consider when choosing a place that we would go for lunch. Like, is it okay if he walks in barefoot? Okay, we worked this out. It was all okay. In the early 1990s, Alan chose to develop this land that he had designed to manage. Okay, start again. Alan chose to develop this land as a nonprofit demonstration site for holistic management, the system he had designed to manage grazing animals. Over several decades, Savory, who grew up in what was then Rhodesia and became a game ranger, naturalist, and later a politician in the opposition, sought to understand how animals impact the landscape. He loved wildlife and was distressed to see the condition of land deteriorate to the point where many animals died of starvation. The assumption always was that there must be too many animals. But then when they fenced off areas in the game parks that they were establishing in the bush regions, the land got worse. This was a conundrum. something else must be going on besides there being too many animals. And maybe there even weren't too many. So this is a picture from that we took in, or that my husband took in at Zimbabwe. And here are the animals going to work in the morning. I remember that this was about 6 in the morning and the sun was just coming up, and you could feel the heat that was about to unleash upon this landscape. It was really, really hot and dusty, but they did their part, and I'll show you. I mean, Alan often complained that they didn't have enough animals for that land. And one other thing that I'd call your attention to is that the animals, they look kind of skinny, not like the robust animals that maybe you aspire to have or work ensure that you have on ranches if you are a rancher. It's a matter of what you are managing for. So they are not managing for high quality steaks, for example, that they would, the meat to sell. They were managing to improve the land. So all of their management decisions were framed according to that priority. So Alan, as many of you may know, had the insight that grazing animals and grasslands co-evolved, so that the land needed the animals in the same way that the animals needed the land. Hadn't the savanna been much more vibrant when great herds of antelope like wildebeest and zebra and giraffe swept across the range? So while land could certainly be overgrazed, it could also suffer from being undergrazed. The land wanted all those animals to be present, to be moving. Through observation, Alan was an expert tracker after all, he came to understand how herbivores were integral to the land. Their nibbling plants stimulated growth. Their waste added moisture and fertilizer. Moisture is really important in that landscape. Their hooves pressed in seeds, assuring a diversity of grasses would have a chance to germinate. And when the cattle bunched up as a herd so that they could flee together in safety from predators, they trampled in plant matter so it would be incorporated into the soil. And so, by keeping grazers moving as if eluding cheetahs, lions, and hyenas, land managers could recreate this scenario. And so when you are moving your animals, you can think about the lions and the antelope and cheetah that inspired this framework. Such management builds carbon in the soil, which in turn allows the soil to hold on to water. Holistic management was my route in to understanding how natural systems work and how soil is central to that. When I was researching my book on soil, it was the holistic management community that was connecting soil with water availability, biodiversity, and financial solvency. And so this proved my training ground. As I mentioned, I had the chance to visit Zimbabwe and see the results. First of all, I have to say that spending 8 days with Alan Savory and Jody Butterfield was amazing. It would be blazing hot during the day. So this was September. That was the end of their dry season, where it was especially hot. But so it would be hot during the day, and then it would cool down beautifully in the evening. And so to sit in the cool of the evening around a fire with Alan and hear his stories of decades of experience, of the time that he woke up from a nap and there was a rhino, like with his horn, like almost in his face. And he somehow had the wherewithal to grab a camera to get a photo of that. But just these incredible stories. And also just to walk the land with someone who can read the land so precisely and with such texture. I remember walking and he would notice if a blade of grass had been moved and why that might, and could try to um, grapple with why that might have been the case, whether it was a giraffe, whether the giraffe was running from a predator or looking for water. So it really brought the landscape to life, which was really a gift of an experience. So now I will share with you some of what I saw. This is the Dimbengombe River, which now runs a full kilometer higher into the catchment than in anyone's living memory and flows throughout the year. So remember those elephants? Thanks to this river being restored, they now find water any place along it. And giving cattle access to the river for limited times rather than just letting the cattle go where they want to go, in which case they would just be hanging by the water all the time, and then which would create erosion and all sorts of problems, silting up of the water. So the way that they managed the animals, that stabilized the banks. And over time, wetland plants like sedges and reeds showed up, as has lots of wildlife like fish eagles, kingfishers, and turtles. And it was interesting how Jody talked about that she would say, she really stressed how it happened over time. Now, there are cases where holistic management can transform a landscape quickly, but this was seriously degraded land and very dry land, very brittle land, if you know that term. Brittleness refers to not how much rain you get. Dry lands where it's all where you have a distinct rainy season and dry season. And that's another really important insight of Alan's that I think is important to dwell on for a moment, because we often think that a landscape is dry because it doesn't get enough rain. But the distribution of moisture across the landscape makes a huge difference and determines what kind of management will work on that landscape. So, for example, my husband, Tony, grew up in Johannesburg, South Africa. And then when he was 11, his family moved to London. And he remembers his childhood in Johannesburg was that it was sunny every day. And this is true. I think there's over 300 days of sunshine in Johannesburg. And he also remembered playing with all the animals and lizards and snakes and all that. Then he went to London and he remembers that it was always raining, it was always dreary, and there were few animals to play with, and they didn't like kids. That was kind of a bummer. So what's interesting, however, is that it turns out that Johannesburg and London have about the same quantity of rainfall. It's just that in Johannesburg, it all occurs within a limited period of time in the late winter I should say, our late winter and spring. It's the fall for them, like around March. I remember being there where it stormed every time we were there. I can still see the lightning in the windows of the homes that we passed. Yeah, so that's the brittleness scale. So yeah, so that's one type of change. One type of change is ecologically, and that's one example. And there are many other examples on this particular landscape, and other examples of enhanced biodiversity. And then here is another example of what more spongy soil and therefore better water infiltration means in human terms. So I remember this woman, Busi, very vividly, and she has a wonderful smile. And she was smiling out of pride and happiness because in this little village, miles and miles off the main highway, this village of Sianyanga, in the Wangi region near a national park in Zimbabwe, they had been dependent on international food aid. And they shared with us the trials of that, how you had to wait in line, how when there wasn't enough food and water, like their children didn't go to school because they were worried that the children were not strong enough to walk the distance to the village school. And just how they would bring their cattle long distances to get water, and sometimes they would lose half their cattle to poachers or to lions. So it was a really, really hard life. So then the Africa Center for Holistic Management, that's the center that I described at Dimbengombe, the center started working with local villages and brought holistic management to them. So the way they designed it is that all the villagers would pool their livestock together because the cattle were their wealth, and the cattle and the sheep and the goats, but nobody had very many. Maybe one family had one cow, another family had two goats. So they would pool all these animals into a single herd and move them around so that all the crop fields had some animal impact. And so for these people, that difference meant being able to grow food for 7 months out of the year, rather than only 2.5 months out of the year around the rainy season. And that meant the difference between food self-sufficiency and dependence on international food aid. And they shared with us that now they are helping other villages. So that was incredible to see. So Alan likes to say that the amount of rainfall you receive is not important. Rather, it's the amount of effective rainfall that you have. And what determines whether rain has a chance to be effective is the quality of the soil. I'm reminded of a comment from a colleague of mine who's based in Algeria, where water scarcity always looms. He said, if we preserve the raindrops where they fall, we will preserve life itself. And importantly, this is something we know how to do. Now we are going to take a little jaunt to Mexico, to the Chihuahuan Desert, some 250 miles south of El Paso. This is Alejandro Carrillo. Now, I belatedly realized that he has spoken on one of these programs. Indeed, he is now well known as a regenerative superstar. But back in 2014, when he reached out to me, he was simply a former tech executive who had taken over Las Damas Ranch from his father and was just beginning to get results and see the seeds of a transformation. So Alejandro told me, when he reached out to me and he was intrigued that I had written a book called Cows Save the Planet. He said, as the author of such a book, he imagined that I would be interested to learn what he and colleagues were working on. Basically, they were collaborating with bird conservation organizations to restore habitat for endangered migratory grassland birds. The birds were suffering because of the degradation of the landscape. Researchers realized that these ranchers were stewarding their cattle and their land in a way that was particularly good for these particular bird species. They were a true bright spot in an otherwise not very favorable scenario. Anyway, Alejandro suggested that I should come down with my notebook and pen, and maybe I'd want to write something about this. I was certainly intrigued. I ran this by Tony, and he said, "That's interesting, I'll go with you." Truly, when I think about my work and the incredible reporter's luck I've had, it kind of blows me away. The times that I said yes to opportunities that turned out to be far richer than I had imagined. So Tony and I spent a week visiting 3 ranches. I saw beautiful animals like these 2 bulls, and I saw beautiful land. At the time, what I was working on, I was exploring the connection between soil, water cycling, and biodiversity. I saw that by the management of cattle here at these ranches, they were seeing abundance where their neighbors were facing desolation. So here you can see it. The Las Damas Ranch is on the right. The image on the left is what pretty much everything else around there looked like. Barren fields littered with carcasses of cows. It was not a pretty sight. So the neighbors would say, well, of course, Las Damas Ranch has more grass and the land is better. He gets more rain over there. But the land was right next door. So how do you explain that? The key is that the kind of management that Alejandro and his colleagues did was such that they ensured that any rainfall they received was effective so that the water doesn't immediately evaporate or stream off, creating erosion and carrying away valuable topsoil, like what happened here. I'm with Alejandro and his oldest daughter of 3, Daniela. You can note the cool pink cowboy boots. I certainly noted those, and asked them to take me to buy some boots, which I did, and I happily wear them all the time. So Alejandro had stopped the truck to point out the deep erosion gullies. You can see that there's just a little bit of grass and a few little, twiggy mesquite plants. At another spot like this, another time we stopped, Alejandro shook his head and said, "When I was young, this place had the best grass." And that is a reminder that we don't always notice ecological change, but tend to assume that what we see is the way that the land has always been. But Alejandro remembered, and that remembering is actually really powerful and important. The story I'd planned to tell about this collaboration with the ranchers and the bird people was that by restoring the water cycle, you also restore biodiversity. And this is certainly true. By ensuring that no areas are grazed down to the ground and building organic matter in the soil, You ensure that moisture remains in the landscape and that this sets the stage for a variety of plants and wildlife to thrive, such as these birds. What surprised me, however, is that it also works the other way, that in turn, biodiversity itself enhances the water cycle. Birds are eating and spreading seeds, ensuring a variety of plants. And these plants stabilize the soil so that it doesn't wash away in wind or rainstorms. Life in the soil, from worms and dung beetles to tiny springtails and nematodes, create pore spaces for water to meander slowly and nourish plants and microorganisms. This creates a virtuous cycle so that the land and the life it sustains gets better and better. That's been what's happening at Las Damas Ranch. They now have 3 times as many head of cattle than they did 15 years ago. The animals are calm and healthy and require no vaccinations and no more than a mineral supplement. And profits are up 350%. Now, one other thing. Unlike me, Alejandro is a very patient person. I would see the decrepit ranches surrounding his operation, and it would make me nuts that they would let their herds and their land suffer rather than follow his lead. Alejandro would nod, he would humor me and say, "Don't worry, they will change when they are ready." This is an aplomato falcon, one of the birds that ecologists were worried about. A new mating pair has been observed on the ranch of Alejandro's neighbor, whose land had looked so horrible when I was there. For indeed, the neighbor did go to Alejandro and say, "I want my land to look like your land." Today, more than 1 million acres in that region are under holistic plan grazing and providing habitat for many birds. So there's a message about patience there, I would say. Will I learn that is, of course, another question. And so we circle back to soil as the root of healthy water cycles, fertility, and biodiversity. It also lays the foundation for the building of wealth, real wealth, wealth that can sustain subsequent generations, whether or not that is recognized in our current economic model. In these 2 glimpses of holistic management, we have 2 examples of land managers that have built that kind of wealth. So that is all of my prepared remarks, but I'm happy to take questions from Jared or from anyone else.
Yeah, this is very cool. We appreciate that. What a tremendous opportunity to learn from the diversity of experience that you've had. Somebody asked for the quote that you said, that as soil degrades, taxes increase.
Oh yeah, isn't that cool? Just again, there's so much wisdom out there. I love bumping into quotes. Okay, so this is from someone. I know where it is. This is from someone named G.T. Wrench, someone from the middle of the last century. He was a physician and very involved in kind of moving forward the organic movement. During that period of time, there were a number of people in the UK who were working on, along the same lines, really focusing on soil. So the quote is, "The stark fact that appears now and which wrote itself across the Roman Empire, is that debt and taxation increase as the soil declines. So isn't that an interesting thought, which brings up the possibility of, if the soil improves, might things change? Might you get some kind of trickle up as opposed to the trickle down we've all been waiting for?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really fascinating to think. I think the challenge is that there's a lag time, right? Whereas if you overspend 1 year, you're going to feel that pretty immediately. But we can deplete soil carbon, burn up soil organic matter, and we may not feel it. Really, would you say, what would be that lag time before we would start to feel the consequences of taking those short-term gains and maybe depleting the soil?
That's a really difficult question to answer, because often one would take other measures to kind of camouflage the decline of the soil. That's where a lot of inputs come in. And
Yeah. Yeah. And so those you're saying those inputs, they continue to bridge the gap and maybe give us the false sense of security that things are okay, when in reality it will catch up to us. And
right, not only will it catch up to us, but it will accelerate the decline of the soil. So one thing that I don't see discussed much is something I learned from someone named Christine Jones. I don't know if many people have heard of her, but she's quite brilliant. There are a lot of her talks are online. She's in Australia, and she has retired. And from what I can see, she's like really retired. Some people retire, but they don't seem to have gone anywhere. But I think she's really retired. So she would talk about how nitrogen fertilizer inhibits the building of soil carbon. And the way she explained it, or at least part of the way she explained it, is that so when you put nitrogen in the soil, then all the microbial life that would be trading minerals for carbon at the roots of the soil, down in the root zone, then they're just going to kind of, lay back and say, I don't have to do the work. The carbon, or not the carbon, but the nitrogen is coming to me. So you don't get all that, the exchange of the minerals, and you don't get the all the building of the soil.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard to understand that, but Christine does a good job of explaining how that works. Basically, we're doing their job for them, and so they can just get lazy and leave. And actually, a lot of times the inputs that we apply that boost yields um, can have damaging effects on the soil microbes. So, what I've been asked, or I've attempted to give this definition of what does regeneration mean. I think 4 times in the last week at different things that I've spoken at, and I would love to hear what your definition is. What does regeneration mean?
Well, something I've seen recently allows me to do a cop out and say it depends on the context, or it
Sure.
depends on where you are. But
I think that's
I think I'll defer to Paul Hawken, who wrote the book Regeneration. Actually, I've got it on my shelf. It's a real big book. that
Yeah.
gives all kinds of examples, but it's basically putting life at the center. So it's regeneration is management that puts life at the center of all decisions. So
Hmm.
if you're doing that, you are engaged in regeneration. Does that make sense? I know there are so many different,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
to keep it as
So
simple as
I, I
possible.
I agree with that. It does depend on the context, and your definition of regeneration is important to you. Hopefully, hopefully we've added some already throughout the seminar. We've added some more ideas to put into your context, and that will, I think, continue to evolve. But uh, something that I asked Rich Brazil about earlier, and I want to ask you also based on your experience, is that increasing the carrying capacity or the land's ability to produce is one way that regeneration is manifest. Perhaps that could be even in the definition. It's in my context, that's part of my definition. But could
Mhm.
you speak to that a little bit and based on, Alejandro is a wonderful example, but maybe others of how when they've applied the principles that they've been able to exponentially increase their carrying capacity, be it stocking rate or the production of farm ground also, I think.
So the question is, how else does regeneration manifest?
Or I guess to make that a question, do you concur with that is part of what regeneration is increasing the carrying capacity? And then why is that so?
Yeah, because it's more life. I mean,
Sure.
in my context, so I don't have a farm. And so, okay, so I'll just tell you my context is that I've written these books and felt called to do some kind of regeneration, like to do something with my hands. And I took a permaculture design course, to give me some ideas. And I took, Tony and I took a kind of per, walk around our land with a permaculture lens. And it
Hmm.
became clear that our priority was biodiversity. So here in Vermont, what I could do is build our the amount that build the native plants here, the trees, the shrubs and flowering plants, to support at-risk native pollinators. So they do that. So I mean, and that's starting to happen. We, I've been putting in plants and really enjoying that. So here the manifestation will be when I start to see many more butterflies, you know,
Okay.
and different kinds of bees. And I saw some interesting bumblebees this year, um, but it will take a while for it to really make a difference. Another thing that I'd like to say about regeneration is that it regenerates in the spirit of the people there.
Hmm.
And because you're working with nature, which kind of aligns with our nature. And it reminds me of a quote, but something that a colleague of mine, I don't know if you know him, someone named John D. Liu. The first chapter in the Reindeer Chronicles is it tells his story. He's a really interesting fellow, really interesting mind, and he documented one of these tremendous stories of transformed landscape in the regeneration or the rehabilitation of the Los Plateau watershed in China, in which an area of land the size of Belgium was returned to ecological function. And it's quite an extraordinary story. And I thought everybody in the world should know that. Well, so having seen that, John reflected that because we know that we can restore even extensive damaged ecosystems, we are obliged to do that. We have to do that. He says there is no choice. And so he delved into ecology, just how ecology works. And what I'm getting to is that something that he says is that the land, the landscape where you are, it's a reflection of human consciousness. So can one be fully alive and fulfilled and at peace on a degraded landscape? I don't know. And does being in a beautiful, functioning, working landscape help lift one's spirit and help you be kind of aligned with life? I just find that very interesting.
Yeah, that is. And I appreciate that sense that if it can be done, it must be done. And we now are learning the tools to be able to do that. Where do you think the tipping point is? Because you probably have a better sense for this, but I would say there's definitely more degeneration happening in agriculture than there is regeneration worldwide. Is that safe to say that
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
a factor of who knows what, but
Yeah.
way more?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to guess, but
Mhm.
there's also more and more awareness of the need to regenerate. I mean, it's really difficult because terms become co-opted so that
Mhm.
it is it if a big corporation uses the word regenerate, I mean, you'd have to look case by case, but I'm seeing there are pretty extraordinary things going on all around the world that are really worth paying attention to. And for anyone who's interested, one podcast that I really recommend because it connects profitability and regeneration is podcast. And I'm mentioning this in part because I'm guessing that maybe not everybody has heard of this.
Mhm.
It's investing in regenerative agriculture and food.
Okay.
And they're starting to have courses, but listening to that, I think they come out once a week, is kind of a course. So you hear from people doing different kinds of regenerative work that is profitable,
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
investment worthy. The interviewer is someone named Koen van Siegen, who
Okay.
is, I probably didn't pronounce it right. He's Dutch and spends half the time in the Netherlands and half the time in Italy.
Nice. That's great. I appreciate that resource. We're always looking for resources like that to be able to share with this community. Um, so how many acres would we need to have? What percentage of the population of farmers and ranchers would there need to be able to reach that tipping point where we are um, overall leaning towards regeneration as a
Yeah,
whole?
yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean that's a huge question. I
Sure.
don't know, but when I'm thinking about tipping points, like tipping points towards health, land health, I think about what someone that I also interviewed in person, someone named Mian, a Spanish meteorologist. And he was quite brilliant. We lost him in his 80s, like a year and a half ago. But he's influenced many people. He did research and found that the loss of the rains, the daily rains in the summer in Spain was a result of devegetation, of the plowing up the marshlands, clearing the trees for development, because the air needed a certain concentration of moisture in order to make a rain.
Yeah.
And it wasn't getting enough moisture. The moisture coming off the Mediterranean had been picking up moisture from the transpiration of the trees and the plants. So he talks about the tipping point that by reforesting and regenerating, I think it was something like 10 square kilometers of land, one can revitalize the water cycle.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of tipping points like that.
Right. I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Walter Genet. Is that how you say it?
Walter, yes, I
Okay.
know him. I
So
know him quite well. Yes.
Okay, that sounds a lot like what he teaches as well, right? That
Oh,
we repair the small water cycle on our operations, which builds towards the greater water cycle, which mitigates the droughts and floods.
absolutely. Yeah, he does incredible work and really has talked about like 10 different ways to enhance the water cycle. He has
Yeah.
essays on that. Yeah, he's really good. Yeah, Walter, I also know quite well. He's stayed in my house, and I still remember
Oh, I'll bet.
that it was around this time of year, and he was very concerned that I hadn't been picking up all the apples from the apple trees right outside our house. And so he picked up those apples. That was very important to him.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he wouldn't be very happy with our family right now either. The deer are eating the apples as fast as they fall, but we did pick up a bunch. So
one thing I wanted to say, and about wealth and regeneration, is that there is a company, and I wrote about this also in Spain, a company in Europe called Common Land that works according to 4 returns. In terms of profitability, so one is profit, is return of capital, but it's also return of nature, return of social capital or community, and return of inspiration, which is kind of this ineffable spirit, collective spirit that I observed in Spain, where Common Land was working, where a community was kind of reconnecting with its heritage and a celebration of what's special about the place. But I mention that because that's an example of people who were, it was driven by this fellow, Willem, I'm blanking his last name, Willem Verwerda, who saw the disconnect between what our economic model supports and the kind of regeneration we need. So this makes business case for restoring land, because you're broadening out how you see success, how you see your returns. So they have really good work too, and guidance for how to actually do restoration on your operation. A lot of free of charge resources.
Love it. Well, that's great. Well, we're gonna move into our next speaker here right away. Judy, thank you so much for
Oh
being
my
with us
gosh.
today. We appreciate the not just speaking here, but all of the work that went into getting you to this point to be able to speak with such authority. And it ties in so well with this theme of being regenerative and being profitable. So, final thought that you might have, Judy?
No, just thank you. And I think it's wonderful how you keep rolling from speaker to speaker, bringing totally different perspectives that actually kind of create a kind of coherent narrative. So I'm
Yeah.
picking up the coherence.
Well, I'm glad you're doing that. Sometimes it seems a little disjointed, but I think that's how nature works, right? There is this symbiosis that's happening here, and if people are open to that, you can absolutely come away more resilient yourself at the end of this, and that's our goal. So,
Okay, well, thank you so much for the
okay,
opportunity.